As you can see from this Statista vertical bar graph, most Americans support rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. Although Trump had committed to withdrawing from the Paris Accord and rescinding the Clean Power Plan, and governmental efforts were clearly aimed at dismantling the environmental policy of the previous administration, most Americans do support environmental policy. So far, Americans have continued to participate in climate negotiations to solidify the agreement. According to the New York Times, the bulk of the rollbacks identified by the Times have been carried out by the Environmental Protection Agency, which has weakened Obama-era limits on planet-warming carbon dioxide emissions from power plants and from cars and trucks, removed protections for more than half the nation's wetlands, and withdrawn the legal justification for restricting mercury emissions from power plants. Even if there is no denying that efforts to reach the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement are in jeopardy, it is hard to assess the impact of the actions undertaken under the Trump administration. The Trump administration questioned the very idea that climate change is real. Consequently, it proposed massive budget cuts to research programs dedicated to the study of global warming, including those of the EPA and NASA. The US Congress largely ignored these proposals. Under the Trump administration, data on climate change was lost and climate monitoring operations were dismantled, leading to the dismay of scientists and some members of the administration to a climate data gap. The EPA thereafter launched a new program aimed at challenging climate science. Climate scientists lost their positions, and people with no scientific expertise started replacing scientists in the administration. The Trump administration reauthorized the construction of the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines while weakening the National Environmental Policy Act. Indeed, according to the terms of the Presidential Executive Order of March 28, 2017 on promoting energy and economic growth, departments and agencies were to immediately review existing regulations that potentially burden the development or use of domestically produced energy resources. This was in line with Trump's America First strategy. The Trump administration also proposed doubling the time allowed for utilities to remove lead pipes from water systems with high levels of lead, even after the Flint, Michigan water crisis. Christine Todd Whitman, a former head of the EPA back in the early 21st century, claimed that she had never seen such an orchestrated war on the environment or science. Some environmental experts believe that the damage done might be permanent in some areas, and that previous time to fight against climate change and try to regain control over the Earth's increasingly extreme temperatures was lost. Even if the previous administration favored isolationist policies and rhetoric and inflicted damage on scientific integrity, the US needs to recognize that it can still play an exceptional role in combating climate change. There are two major reasons for that. The US has for a long time played a major part on the world stage, and it should not shun away from it now when the world has to deal with the global crisis of the 21st century. The US is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases and had been the largest emitter of greenhouse gases for a long time until China became the largest in 2006. The US is the second largest emitter of CO2, which approximately 5.41 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions in 2018. The largest sources of CO2 emissions in the US comes from power generation, transportation, and industry. Even though the US government undertook significant efforts to reduce the reliance on coal for electricity generation, the country has become a major producer of crude oil. Also, the US economy is heavily reliant on the transportation sector, which burns petroleum for trucks, ships, trains, and planes. US consumers especially depend on their cars as their primary means of transportation, and this also contributes to the CO2 footprint through gasoline and diesel. Another large contributor to CO2 emission in the US is industry, which burns fossil fuels for energy. Also, US chemical sector uses various chemical reactions necessary to produce goods from raw materials, which in the process emit CO2. This is from the page of Investopedia, which explains that 5 countries produce most carbon dioxide. And of course, the focus is on the United States. The country's reliance on fossil fuels could have declined since its coal production has declined, coal production being one of the biggest drivers of CO2 emissions. The US also turned to sources of renewable energy such as biofuels, wind, and the solar energy. Yet, the US has become the largest producer of crude oil and refined petroleum, in the meantime surpassing Saudi Arabia, and its industry, most notably its electricity, power, and transportation industry, largely contributes to CO2 emissions. Therefore, its reliance on fossil fuels remains remarkable. Environmental policy is here to stay. The EPA cannot completely overturn its policy in the 4-year span of a single presidential mandate. Any attempt at modifying rules and regulations is met with active resistance on the parts of scientists, politicians, even politicians who belong to the Trump administration, environmental activists, and the general American public too. Even big business will resist these changes. It is true that many large corporations, including Google and Apple, have committed to move to renewable energy and reduce their carbon footprint. The federal government's commitment to invest massively in scientific research and education is most needed. Such public investment would prevent Americans from embracing political beliefs that lead to trust false information and misinformation more than evidence-based information. Misinformation in all its violence may have become a social ill, generating a crisis as severe as major crises that Walter Scheidel has come to equate to the horsemen of the apocalypse. Those are wars, transformative revolution, state failure, and pandemics. Fortunately, there can be only 4 of them. According to Scheidel, violence of such a scale may actually act as a great leveler, thus reducing social and economic inequalities in the long run. If that theory proves to be right, America in the future may not be as exceptionally unequal as it is today. As Scheidel says, if history is anything to go by, peaceful policy reform may well prove unequal to the growing challenges ahead. But what are the alternatives? All of us who prize greater economic equality would do well to remember that with the rarest exceptions, it was only ever brought forth in sorrow. Be careful what you wish for.